Missing someone. Missing someone. Missing someone.
So my first idea was to have a tube bodice, puff sleeves, backless, and knee-length circle skirt. But then I saw this design from Pinterest, and I really loved the back center slit design of it, as it gives a more matured and sophisticated look. The first thing that I did was to cut out my pattern pieces on paper, and then using a fabric that I don't use at home, I cut the similar pieces and then sew them right sides together. And then I took my sample piece to my mannequin, and there was excess fabric, so I had to take it in, as it was not hugging my body at all. So what I did here was to just pinch and put pins on where it is needed, and then using a marker I marked where I want the new seams to be, and then just sew it right sides together. So this is what it looks like afterwards, and I just marked where I want and how I want the neckline to be shaped. I cut it out afterwards. Next step was to seam rip everything apart so we could look and see what changes we have made, and to transfer those changes and mark them on the original pattern pieces, so that if I want to make the same design again, I wouldn't have to keep on adjusting it. Remember to put the seam allowances as well. Right now, I'm cutting out the pattern pieces on the actual fabric that I will be using for the gown. So these are the pattern pieces that I had, because I will be making a lining. I am just arranging the pattern pieces I need for the outer layer of my bodice, and press it and then cut it, because it's easier that way. I fitted the bodice to my mannequin, and I'm not sure what happened because I still needed to adjust it. Do the same thing to the lining. I went ahead and overlocked the edges. We will be using the boning on the lining just to add extra structure. This is what it looks like after I sewed down the seam allowances. Make sure to leave enough room for the boning to fit in. Face the two bodices right sides together and make sure to align the seams. Then sew. And then I understitch so that the lining wouldn't show when I'm wearing the gown. For the skirt pattern, I will just be using a normal foundation block. Here I folded the fabric on bias or diagonally, just so that when I wear the skirt, it wouldn't restrict me in movement. I then measured how much long I want it to be and cut. These are the pattern pieces that I ended up with. Face them right sides together and sew along the sides. So I went to my mannequin and started draping my skirt. I wanted to see where I needed to put the darts in, so that I want them to be aligned on the princess seams. I then measured how much I need to take in and drew a triangle. Pressing does really make a difference on your finished garment. So here I am just pressing the darts in the seam so that it lays flat. The next thing I did was to pin the skirt to the bodice with the interfacing. I made sure to align the seams and the darts together, then sew across. Now I will be making the lining skirt. Using the same technique, I put the fabric on a diagonal fold. For the lining skirt, since it will be inside, I didn't have to be strict about where I had to place the darts, so I just went along with what's in the pattern piece. One thing that I found out after sewing the garment is that I didn't need to have darts at the front of the skirt because it should have laid flat. Adding the darts actually made the front look weird, but I fixed this by lengthening them. Face them right sides together and sew on the sides. I went ahead and overlocked the edges as well. Round up the edges so that it wouldn't poke through the fabric and hurt the person wearing the gown. Now is a good time to actually measure how much you need for each casing. Just make sure to leave a little bit of seam allowance. Here I am aligning the seams, right sides together and sewing the lining bodice and the lining skirt. Next thing that I did was to overlock the edges, but separately, not together. My first attempt for the puff sleeves had a pattern that looks like this. I sewed 2 rows of basting stitches for me to pull together. This is how it looked like. It was alright, but it wasn't as puff as I wanted it to be. And this is the second attempt because I figured out I really need a lot. And then I sew each side, wrong sides facing each other first and then right sides facing each other. This is called the French seam. The next thing that I did was to make a cut of 3.5 inches for the placket. Then sew 2 rows of basting stitches and gather it up. Here, I am just trying it out to see if I made the same measurement for my wrist so that it's not too tight or not too loose. Next thing that I did was to cut out a strip to finish off the placket. So here I am just laying it out, pinning it, and sewing it straight across. I folded it 2 times to cover the raw edges and top stitched it. I made sure that the inside fabric was being sewn as well. This is what it looks like on the inside, and then I had to sew a triangle. For the cuff, I made a pattern that overlaps 1 inch, and I also made sure to add the seam allowances. The overlap is for the button. Cutting it out. And then getting a lightweight interfacing. I wish I could have used a white interfacing, but black is what I had at that moment because the black actually made the golden color of the silk darker, which made it a different shade of gold. This is what it looks like, and then I trimmed away the excess material, and then I sewed on each side, and I poked the pencil for the points to come out. And at this part, I am sewing one side of the cuff to the sleeve. And then I'm folding it to hide the raw edges and sew it down again. The next thing I'm doing is just cutting strips for the strings or for the ribbons. and cutting it on bias. This is how much I made. To have long strings or ribbons, I need long strips of fabrics, so I had to join all of them. And I did that by sewing diagonally. And then I just trim away the edges, and then I pressed it down, and I pressed it in half and sew right sides together, and then just trimming away the edges as well. Next thing I did was to use a loop turner and turn it inside out. Then I cut it in half, having 2 strings for both arms. The next thing that I did was to cut a piece of fabric that will go on top of the sleeve pattern. This is where the strings will be inserted as well. Because the strip is not made to the right size yet, I just leave a little bit of seam allowance and then pin and sew it in place. And then I cut out the excess material and just sew a straight line. I then marked out where I want my eyelets to be and snipped a little bit of fabric, just enough for the eyelets to be inserted. This is what it looks like. The other one was messed up and the other one was good. I then fold it 2 times to hide the raw edges and then pin it down. And then top stitch. And then I inserted the ribbons or the strings afterwards. The next thing that I did was to measure 1 inch away from the edge so that I can figure out where I wanted to sew my zip. Remember to only sew on the outside fabric and do not sew the inner lining. I then replaced my normal foot with the zipper foot. Here, I am only sewing the zipper down so it will be easier later. And then, the second time around, I changed the setting of my machine of the needle to go to the farthest left and push the invisible zipper on the side and just sew as close as I can to the teeth. This is what it looks like. And then I took where the separation from the bodice and the skirt and marked it on the zipper so that it will be easier for me to align it on the other side. Again, make sure to not sew on the lining and only on the outside fabric. I then turn it and then, using the marking, I sew. Here I am just sewing it down again, and after sewing it down to hold it in place, I push the teeth away and sew as close as I can. Here I folded the lining 1/2 centimeter away from the teeth so that it doesn't get caught up whenever I open and close my zipper. I then sew an invisible stitch by hand to have a more professional and finished look. I then join the bottom edges and remove the zipper out of the way and sew 1 inch as seam allowance. I was planning to hand sew it to have an invisible seam, but it didn't work out as I wanted it, so I just brought it to the sewing machine and sewed it down. I went to my local fabric and crafts shop to look for buttons and a golden elastic for the cuffs. This is what I got. Tie a loop or a knot. I then seam ripped the side and inserted the knot and sewed it down. Make sure that the loop or knot is big enough or can stretch enough to accommodate the button. Here I am aligning the seams from the bodice and the sleeves and sewed it down. This is the finished look.
I'm done. I'm retired.
Thank you for watching.